I'm not going to do exactly the same talk as 2 years ago because that would be slightly redundant given that the previous talk is online as well. So I'll give you a taster of what narrative analysis is. So I'll give you a bit of background in terms of how it's developed within the social sciences and what kind of method it is. And then I'll give you 2 examples from published papers that have used narrative analysis. And they're kind of focusing on different types of narrative. And I'm hoping to give you an idea of how narrative analysis could be used to analyse different types of text. But first, I'm going to start off with 2 examples. So, first example is I fell in love with Mark, my marriage ended. And the second one is my marriage ended, I fell in love with Mark. Two sentences just switched around. Why are those 2 different? What's the meaning behind? What meaning do you read behind example 1 and example 2? Anyone? Time is going, yeah. So there's time. We can see time. So we're moving from time. We're moving from falling in love to a marriage ending or vice versa. But what we've got there is causality. There's an indication or there's an implied causality there in terms of just the order in which those sentences are presented. So the causality in the first one would be that falling in love with Mark means that the marriage ends. So that's what usually happens. If we fall in love with someone else, our marriage might end. Whereas in the second one, the causality is that there isn't that same kind of causality. It's just that someone's marriage has ended and then they have fallen in love with Mark later on. So we've got time and we've got causality there. And those are 2 sort of key aspects of narrative. So when we're looking at narrative, we of course have to define what a narrative is. And a very simple definition of narrative is that it's a non-random sequence of events. So like in the previous examples, although those sentences could be read as separate from each other as well, but the fact that they were put together in a narrative implies that sequence of events is non-random. That is, there's an implication of causality there, that one thing leads to another. So there's a plot, there was a rudimentary plot. Just by putting those 2 sentences together, you've got an idea of a plot. And as we've also established that narratives convey movement through time and they convey some kind of action. So these are basic sort of defining aspects of what a narrative is. And why we might want to look at narratives as social scientists. I'm assuming most of you are social scientists or at least interested in doing social sciencey type analyses. Narratives are important because we're fundamentally, language is one of the fundamental tools through which we make sense of the world and we make sense of the experiences that happen to us. And not only language, but narrative. So as Reisman says there at the bottom of the slide, people lead storied lives. And by that she means that as we experience things, the moment we experience something and start to think about it, we're using narrative. We're starting to link events, for example. We understand what happens today as somehow linked to what's happened before, for example. So we're making the events that we experience non-random by linking them through narrative. And we do this constantly. So whatever's happening, and just pay attention to your own kind of internal monologues or thoughts from now on in terms of how you're constructing these narratives in your head constantly as you experience things. And we also, one of the main ways of communicating with other people is, of course, through narrative. So language is a shared cultural tool through which we communicate with each other. So not only do we tell these narratives to ourselves about what's happening around us or within us, but we also communicate to others who we are, what's happened to us, how we ended up being who we are today as a result of what's come before. So this is what Reisman means by it when she says that we lead storied lives, that narratives are an inherent part of our everyday experiences, and narratives are the way in which we make sense of the world. Now, narrative analysis is a fairly sort of recent approach within the social sciences. I mean, it's existed long before that within sort of, for example, literature, but it's become increasingly popular. So if you, for example, do sort of hits on sort of Google Scholar, for example, you'll find that hits on sort of narrative analysis within the social sciences have increased considerably since the 1990s. And there's now even a journal called Narrative Inquiry that focuses specifically on narratives and narrative analysis. As with a lot of methods within the social sciences, narrative analysis is interdisciplinary. And it has to be interdisciplinary because a lot of the tools that we use within narrative analysis we've borrowed from, for example, linguistics or literature studies. So this means that there isn't a unified method. There isn't like a particular technique that I could teach you today of this is how you do narrative analysis. Or actually, if I did that today and said this is how you have to do narrative analysis, I'd be doing you a disservice because there are many different ways in which you can do narrative analysis, thanks to the interdisciplinary nature of this method. So narrative analysis is more like an umbrella concept or an umbrella term for a whole host of different techniques, different sort of approaches and analytical approaches. So there are no sort of hard and fast rules as to this is what you have to do. So I can't give you like a step-by-step guide of this is how you do a narrative analysis. So each researcher has kind of find their own technique, as it were, by reading about how other people have done narrative analysis and then thinking about how they can adapt those techniques to their own research topic and their own research questions and also their own data. And I'll say a few words about data as we go along today. But we can sort of identify, or at least I've identified 4 central characteristics that tend to sort of appear in most types of narrative analysis. Now, the first one is that narrative texts are used as data. And I've put text in quotation marks because it's not just text as we understand it as words on a page, as I'll say a few more words about that in a moment. Narrative analysts tend to be interested in the social origins of narratives. So we're not just analysing a narrative, or as social scientists, we're not just analysing a narrative in a decontextualized fashion. What we're doing is we're trying to understand that narrative, that individual narrative, as part of a broader scheme of narratives, as it were. So we're trying to understand, for example, the cultural aspects of a narrative. Why is it that people in the same culture tend to tell the same types of narratives? They tend to sort of use the same genres, for example, or use the same kind of narrative frameworks when they're telling their narratives. So people draw on these narrative conventions, and as social scientists, we're very interested in who draws on which narrative conventions and what does that say about that person, but about society as well. The third aspect of narrative analysis that tends to be shared is that most narrative analysts take an interpretive approach. Now, this means that language isn't analysed, language isn't taken at face value, as it were. And we don't expect that language to give us direct access to the experience that it describes. There are different approaches to language. This is one approach, and it's one that most narrative analysts tend to take. So if we want to, for example, understand what really, quote unquote, really happened, a narrative analyst would probably say yes, but how would you actually know? Because as we can see, just by looking at those 2 sentences at the beginning, how you interpret 2 sentences on a page is quite different. So how the people in this room, for example, interpret an event is going to be quite different as well. So that the idea of there being kind of one sort of objective event, as it were, that people could describe accurately, that's one that most narrative analysts would probably say that we can't even hope to achieve that. So the interest in language is slightly different. The interest is in looking at how people use language. So looking at language as a tool and looking at it as a cultural tool that reflects the sociocultural context of the person using that language. So language is one of the things that connects the individual or the self to society. And that's what as social scientists we tend to be interested in. The fourth aspect of narrative analysis is that most analysts tend to be interested in context. So not just interested in the narrative in itself, but also interested in understanding who told that narrative and who was the audience. Because both the teller and the audience, or the imagined or intended audience, will shape how that narrative is told. But also the situation or the context within which a narrative is told will shape that, as we'll see in the first example that I'll show you later on today. Now, in terms of focus, we can use narrative analysis to look at different types of narrative, as I've already indicated. I've here sort of divided them into two broad categories of, first of all, we can look at how individuals make sense, for example, of their identity, of their experiences, but also we can make sense of how collectives, how groups make sense of the world. And I'll give you an example of each of these later on. So when we're looking at how individuals make sense of their experiences, we're interested, for example, in narrative identity. So how does a person construct their sense of self through the narratives that they tell about their experiences? And that seems to be a fairly popular approach within narrative analysis. And I would say that's actually probably the most popular one, is the focus on the narratives that individual people tell. And for example, within sociology of health and illness, narrative analysis has been used quite a bit to look at how people with severe illnesses or impairments use narrative to make sense of their self as a person with this illness, particularly if that illness is a sudden one and has kind of created like a narrative break within that person's life story. But there are also some narrative analysts who are interested in how groups, such as, for example, the medical profession or politicians, the narratives that are kind of created within these fields. So one of the examples I'll show you in a bit is a narrative analysis of a policy document. And we have, for example, narratives of nations. So nations tell these narratives about who they are as a nation and how they ended up being the nation that they are today. So, for example, history texts could be read as narratives of nation. Now, as I've already mentioned before, there's a variety of narrative texts that could be looked at. So we've got both the kind of the written and the oral, first of all. So we've got, words written on a page, or words spoken by a person. And these can be found in the private, public or political realm, so the different types of narrative there. Or we could be interested in naturally occurring narratives. So, for example, two of the kind of the classics within this, Labov and Valetsky, where they analysed narratives of sort of everyday talk among African American men. But we can also then ask people to either write or tell us narratives specifically for that research. So, for example, I've looked at narratives written by women in Finland, and they were responding to a call asking women to write their life stories and send them to this project. And as I've already mentioned, we can then also be looking at public or policy documents or media texts and so on. Now, of course, we can also look at narratives that aren't spoken, that aren't linguistic in that sense. So, for example, Reisman makes an argument that we could think of movement as a narrative. So there are people who use narrative to study dance, for example. Now, in terms of doing narrative analysis, what you could focus on is both form and both content. So you could focus both on what is said, so the words that are used, what they might mean, but also how it's said. So the rhetorical devices, for example, that a person might use to make their narrative, for example, more appealing or more convincing. And the examples that I show in a bit will contain both. So, but both of them are looking at both what is said and how it's said. Now, when doing narrative, one of the reasons for doing narrative analysis is that if we do narrative analysis, what we're doing basically is that we're preserving an aspect of speech or text that's kind of there. And that is the fact that people tend to speak in narratives. So when someone tells you something, they tend to tell you a narrative. They tend to tell you a story. So if you're doing sort of cross-sectional thematic analysis, which is fine, I'm not slagging off cross-sectional thematic analysis here, but if you do that, you're not focusing on the kind of the narrative aspects of the text that you've got. You're focusing on something different. So a lot of narrative analysts are kind of drawn to this method because it does respect a fundamental feature of much of the data that we collect as social scientists. So when we go out and interview people, we get narratives. And sometimes it can be worth to just leave them as narratives and to focus on not only what is said, but how people tell their lives. What kind of frameworks of understanding do they use? And how do they make links between different events, for example, or different aspects of their self? Now, this, of course, then requires quite a close reading of text because you're having to pay attention to how a person is using language. And then that usually means that you can't have huge samples. So the samples for narrative analysis tend to be relatively small. And again, I can't tell you exactly, what's the right number for narrative analysis because, again, it depends on the depth you're going into. So if you're going to analyse every single word, you might only have one case. If you're going to do a not such a close reading, you might have 17 or 20. Some people might have 40 or more. So it kind of depends what type of narrative analysis you're doing. But also because we tend to want to keep the narrative as a whole. So every story that's told us, we want to keep it as a whole and analyse it as a whole. That also then means that we usually present our findings in terms of case studies, because that seems to be the kind of the natural way of if you're analysing narratives in a holistic sense, it somehow makes sense to also present your findings in a similar way. Now, that isn't the only way of presenting narrative analysis findings, but it tends to be one of the features. So we'll see again the examples that I show you today. They present sort of cases, as it were. Any questions on that was so far what I've got to say on narrative analysis in general. Has anyone got any questions on that? Okay, so I'll now show you two examples. These are sort of articles that I like. It's actually I was trying to find articles for this talk that would actually show and tell what they did in terms of narrative analysis, and it was actually very hard because by the time people publish, then they're not giving you a very close indication of how they actually conducted the narrative analysis. But these are two of the kind of best in terms of giving an idea of how you might actually conduct narrative analysis. And the first one is an article by Lois Presser. And in this study, or in this paper, she's focusing on gendered interactions. So she's focusing on interactions between herself and the men that she interviewed, and looking at sort of aspects of gendered power within those interactions. So she's here looking at, remember when I earlier said that there are various things that we could be interested in. So one of the things she's interested in here is the context of the telling, and how the context of the telling and the interaction between the people in that in that context helps create the narrative. So narratives are kind of situated, they're produced in particular situations by particular people with a particular audience in mind. So in this paper, Lois Presser says that social scientists would need to write themselves in more into their analysis, especially if they've used interviews as a technique for collecting data, because that means that they have co-constructed that data as interviewers, and not only co-constructed it through the questions they ask, but through the actual interaction and the power dynamics, for example, within that interaction. So this paper is based on a study that Presser conducted, where she did qualitative interviews with men who'd committed serious violent crimes. So these were men who were generally incarcerated, so in jail at the time of being interviewed. And they were in jail for a range of different crimes, including murder, assault, and rape. And a lot of these crimes had been committed against women. And Presser in this paper is interested in how the interaction between herself and the men that she interviewed, how that helped shape the narratives that these men told. And she's interested both in situating these narratives in the macro level, and by macro level she means sort of the broader social, economic and political context. So for example, she pays attention to the men's race, ethnicity and class as factors in explaining the kinds of narratives that they're likely to tell. But she's then also interested in the micro level, so the interaction between herself and the men that she interviewed. And she's also interested in sort of positioning herself as a white middle class woman researcher, and then the men as incarcerated offenders, so that the fact that the men are actually in jail at the time of interview, or most of them are in jail at the time of interview. And in fact, one of the case studies she presents in this paper is a man who's on death row and was then executed. And in this paper, Presser presents the findings of an analysis where she mixed holistic and thematic aspects. And this is actually quite usual, quite common among narrative analysis, that we might start out by doing like a thematic analysis across cases, but then also combine that with doing a holistic analysis of individual narratives. So in this paper, she begins from and this is how she said that she did the analysis as well, that she started from the thematic, and then shifted on to looking not only at sort of what the men were saying, but how they were saying it. So the first kind of thematic portion of her analysis meant that she coded her interview data according to sociologically interesting themes. But then at the same time, she was also then looking at the holistic aspect of each individual narrative by looking at the coherence of a narrative. So how is it that a person tells a coherent story of themselves? So she was here interested in kind of the narrative identities that these men portrayed, but also interested in how the interaction between herself and the men, what part that played in the narrative self that these men constructed in that situation. And after this kind of more kind of broad overview of the data, she then moved on to focus on 8 aspects that kind of arose out of the thematic analysis. So she was looking, for example, at the social distinctions that the men drew, so distinctions they drew between themselves and other people, men's talk about their true selves, and how they talked about themselves over time, but also how the men were using the interview, and as we'll see in a bit, they were using the interview to present a moral self and a decent self. And that's something that's come out quite commonly comes out of research looking at sort of offenders and people who are kind of committed violent crimes, is that as all of us, we all tend to present moral selves in our narratives. So that's one of the functions of narrative, is to be able to present yourself as an acceptable member of a group. And then she was also interested in the ways in which she herself shaped the interview. And from this, she developed a second generation of themes. And here she was focusing on these men's constructions of a moral self. And then towards the end of the paper, Presser presents 2 case studies. So she presents the narratives of 2 men who she interviewed. And both men she interviewed, I think she interviewed both men over a period of time, so not just once. And for each of the interviews, she created memos. And in these memos, she was paying attention to not only what was said, but paying attention to the interaction, what was going on between herself and the man she was interviewing. And she says she did this because these narrative identities, they're always situated. And then if they're situated within an interaction between 2 or more people, these narrative identities are collaboratively produced, because the audience is always part of the narrative that's being told. So we start telling a story, and the minute if I were to start telling you a story, I would be kind of trying to gauge your response to it, and would probably kind of shape my story. So if I told you something and you looked horrified, I would probably think that's maybe not something I want to tell you more about, and move on to the next thing. So the audience is there, part of the narrative that's being told. And Presser's here interested in looking at how they were doing gender. Not only the men were doing gender, but she was also doing gender in these interactions. And as I said, through narrative, we can present a socially acceptable self. So one of the things that most people want to do is to present an appropriate gendered self as well. And those of you who've read Garfinkel know the work that goes into doing gender, as it were. So our gendered performances are never natural, but they're kind of learnt. And one of the ways in which we do gender, of course, is through what we tell about ourselves. So Presser says that these men were enacting a decent self to her, and that the fact that she was a heterosexual woman meant that she was a very particular audience for these presentations of a decent self. So if the interview had been a man, the doing of gender would have been quite different in those interview contexts. So one of the things these men would do is what she calls chivalrous masculinity. So, for example, offering her advice on men, and kind of advising her to sort of avoid men like themselves who are likely to batter her to death. And she says that this kind of chivalry positions the female in terms of hegemonic femininity. So it positions her as a woman who's vulnerable and heterosexual. But she then says that there's a darker side to this chivalry, and that darker side is that it's also an assertion of authority. So she analyses the ways in which the men would try to assert their authority over her. But she says that it wasn't just the men who were doing gender, she was also doing gender. So she was also positioning herself in gendered ways. So helping these men present a decent self and helping them to present a particular form of masculinity. So, for example, she'd alleviate tension in situations in a sort of fairly typical feminine manner. And she'd also not challenge these men's accounts. So that was an example of an individual, how individuals narrate a self. The second example I've got is an analysis of a policy document. This is a report that was written after a pilot project in Canada, and the pilot project was the Electrical and Fire Safety Inspection Initiative. Now, you wouldn't think that has got anything to do with cannabis, but in Canada it does. So the pilot project was, very shortly, the idea was to pilot the aim was to catch people who were growing cannabis in their homes. So residential cannabis growing operations, or grow-ops. And in the pilot project, what they piloted was that the police would have access to the records of utility companies, so that any residential household that was using more electricity than would be expected of a house that size would then get a visit from this pilot, from the police. And the idea was also that the police would knock on these doors and say, we're here to inspect your property. Either you let us in now or within 24 hours. If you don't let us in, your power will be cut off. And so the report was then to sort of report on how successful this project had been in actually then capturing people who were growing cannabis at home. And Carter does an analysis of this because she says that the policy process is a storied one. So if you read any policy document, what they're trying to do is they're trying to tell a particular story. So if you read any, for example, a green paper by one of our government's green papers, you will see that they're trying to tell a particular story about what's happening in society. And while they're doing this, policymakers are offering claims. They're offering claims about what's happening, and also they're then formulating policy responses. So that they're trying to convince the reader that the policy response that they are suggesting is the right one. So these are narratives that not only reflect but also very much shape, or can help shape, social context. And in terms of this particular policy report, Carter says that it's very important to do this kind of critical reading of such policies, is because she says that these policies are, or policies can be a tool of social control. And she also says that there's a lack of critical research of these policy responses to cannabis growing. So the way in which the report is storied is that these kind of disparate elements that you might not necessarily connect are actually linked in the story, so that they appear to sort of connect with each other causally. And the story, the way that the report is storied, makes these connections seem natural. So that the aim is to convince you that these disparate elements are connected. And the disparate claims that they're linked into a narrative of grave public danger. And one of the ways in which the rhetorical strategies that are used in this report, for example, the use of statistics as kind of evidence of, that there being a massive problem with these grow-ops in Canada. But also statistics to show how successful this particular pilot project was. And those of you who want to sort of go and find out more, you can read Carter's paper to see how she then actually refutes those statistics and says, well, actually, those statistics don't tell the whole story, or they are statistics that in the report are interpreted in a particular way, but she argues they're actually interpreted in the wrong way. And the report also then constructs these sort of good, innocent citizens that are at risk of this grave public safety danger. One of the safety dangers is the fire hazard of using these high voltage lamps in growing cannabis. And these good citizens are then kind of pitted against these bad cannabis growers. And by constructing the bad cannabis grower, the report's author uses these kind of pre-existing racialized narratives. So, for example, depicting cannabis growers as part of Asian gangs, and also othering narratives, for example, depicting these growers as part of motorcycle gangs. So these are kind of pre-existing, very familiar narratives of so-called dangerous others that are then used to kind of as a rhetorical strategy to convince the reader that these grow-ups are actually a problem. So they're constructing superdeviance, or the report is constructing superdeviance. And at the same time, the report depicts Canada's justice system as completely overwhelmed by this problem of cannabis grow-ops. And because the criminal system is overwhelmed, the report argues that this then warrants the use of police procedures that don't require sort of search warrants, for example. And because the report also describes grow operators, or there's an assumed guilt of grow operators, there's even an assumed guilt of anyone who uses more electricity than they should. There's an assumed guilt there already. So it's possible then to dispense with due process. So if these people are guilty already, you don't need a search warrant because you know they're guilty, is how the report sort of argues the case. So then at the end, the report can conclude that this pilot project is actually the only way of addressing the problem of these grow-ops in Canada. So I've given you a bit of a taster of what narrative analysis is and what it can be used for. And I'm assuming these slides will go on the web as well. So there's a few web links for you to sort of find out more about narrative analysis. And that leaves about 10 minutes for questions then.